I did what you're supposed to do, and I read the Bible, and I read it so much that I figured out what was wrong with it. You know, there's like a happy medium. There's like a sweet spot where you know it well enough to commit it to memory and try to live by it as best as you understand it. But you get to know it too well and you start seeing through it. And then you realize there's all kinds of problems. And I don't even know where to start in telling people who are still in the inside of that bubble how many things are off. You know, I don't even know where to start. And that's part of the frustration that I've got right now, is that if it was difficult to communicate with people still inside the evangelical Christian faith 10 years ago when I first left, it is significantly harder now, because we don't even seem to be appealing to the same reality. We're looking at two totally different realities. And I want to talk about why that's happening, because I think it has to do with human nature. And I think it also explains what it is that especially lifelong atheists have not yet figured out about faith. You know, when I was working my way out of my own faith and deconstructing or deconverting or whatever, I looked for people who could help me understand what it was I was doing. But most of the people who had written at the time about faith in a critical light, they did it from the outside looking in. You know, they did it as outsiders who had never been on the inside. And listening to their descriptions of religion, it sounded totally unfamiliar to me, like nothing at all that I was a part of. So I started trying to explain to other people what it was that unpacking your baggage from evangelical faith was like. And it's really hard to make people understand. But now what's happening is that same kind of problem that I saw for those who are inside the evangelical bubble, we're starting to see that in larger bubbles, because it turns out we're all really easy to radicalize. You know, like humans in particular, we're like 48 bad hours away from joining a cult. Most of us, you know, unless your life is just very, very secure and stable. It used to be that you could set up a life and keep that life for 50 years in the same place, and your family lived in the same place. And you had a sense of identity from that because you were tied to the geography of the area. But that's not really the way it is anymore. At this point, we've all had to scatter so many different ways. And even the jobs that we get, they keep shifting. You might get bought out by some other company and then ported to somewhere else. And then it's almost like, if I can use the shows that we watch on Netflix and, you know, Hulu, it's like being in a show where the cast members keep changing, you know, or maybe only one cast member changed, but it's like the romantic lead. And it's difficult to adjust, or maybe even the main character got swapped out for somebody else. That's what it feels like now. Ever since everything started changing about 18 months ago, it's like I wake up and I try to figure out which reality I'm in today, because I don't really know. It takes a while to kind of get my bearings, because so many things are still different. And there's so many things you can't predict now, because the human behavior element is always an unpredictable variable in all the equations. You know, if you're a person who likes to know things ahead of time and plan them 6 months in advance, this has been a maddening time period, you know, because it's difficult to predict what's going to happen 6 months from now. We might be in the middle of facing a virus that we're trying to do things to combat, and your governor turns around and won't let you fight the virus. You know, it's the strangest, most bizarre world to live in. And it's like an alternate reality. But I feel like some of what I understood about the religion I was a part of helps me understand what's going on there as well. The more times you've had to shift from one world to another, the more you start to sort of dissociate from who you used to be. And I want to talk about why that is. And I think it has to do with the fact that we understand ourselves through stories. But if your story keeps changing, then you're going to have a hard time keeping the same identity that you did. And each time you have to update your story, it changes the shape of it, which kind of changes your own self in a way. I know that this is going to sound, by the way, really scattered, a lot of these different things that I'm talking about, but they're all going to kind of tie together in a second. The question I keep asking myself is, how did this happen? How did a pandemic hit our species? And yet we had this hard of a time just responding to it in a way that's sensible. And the answer is because we are so easy to lie to. Humans are very easy to lie to. Once you tell them what they want to hear, they will believe you. And that's not only true of one side of the political spectrum. That's true of just humanity in general. And I don't know that everybody really appreciates that quite enough. We get really good at picking out other people's faults, but we don't see them in our own. And people like me who started out religious and then had to work our way out of it, we have this profound sense of our ability to be wrong. and it introduces a kind of epistemic humility where no matter what it is that I think, and I think I understand the way the world is, it's going to change again because that's how it's supposed to work. You're supposed to be able to adapt to a changing environment. It just gets hard. The older you get, the tireder you get, the more times you've had to reinvent yourself, the more times it's hard to even have a connection with who you once were. Because like I said, we see ourselves through our stories. And the more the stories change, the harder it becomes to hang on to who you are, your own identity. So now imagine somebody swoops in at a time where everyone is disjointed from one another because first they were already polarized over political issues. And then a pandemic hit that made everybody go have to stay inside their houses and change their jobs. And I don't know how many different ways your life changed over the last 18 months, but mine changed 3 or 4 times so much that it's hard to even figure out how many different changes there were. It was like seismic shifts underground, like an earthquake. Only instead of just moving a few inches at a time, it's more like you just woke up and found yourself in a different state. That's what it's like to go through the kind of shift in reality that we had. And that made us perfect sitting ducks for radicalization. There's this meme I want to show you. Let me make sure I can show this correctly because I think this. All right, your parents in 1996, don't trust anyone on the internet. Your parents in 2016, freedomeagle.facebook says Hillary invented AIDS. Well, so I think this captures an amazing thing that I've watched happen, which is that the people who taught me how to think critically quit doing it themselves because they got to a point where I guess they were comfortable in their lives and they learned which sources of information they trust. Not that anybody would trust freedomeagle.facebook, which is funny, but the point is just that I think for a lot of people, they grew up trusting that what was on the news could be trusted because it used to be that there were standards for that. There was more regulatory oversight for the media when we were younger, right? And in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, but there's been a lot of deregulation. And so now media has been cut loose to just adapt to the market. So now just whatever sells gets said. And unfortunately, there's no guide rails for that. The only guide rails are whatever makes money. So I've got people in my life who watch TV channels. Well, they're not really TV channels, but they watch it on their TV and it's really through websites. But anyway, they believe whatever they hear. And I don't understand why they don't think more critically about it. It's not because they're not smart. It's because they've learned to trust certain sources. And for them, those relationships, that trust relationship with these sources is stronger than their curiosity to test and see whether or not their sources are really reliable. And that's what it comes down to is this emotional element. And I don't know that everybody always appreciates that. The reason why people stay in the faith is not because they're less smart than people who leave the faith. Some of the smartest people that I know are still inside the faith and they just do all the mental gymnastics it takes to stay there. Or maybe they figured out a long time ago that they don't even believe most of what they say they believe. But to admit it out loud would be devastating to their lives, to their social lives, maybe even their financial lives. Some of us built our whole social and financial life around ministry. And so leaving it is a pretty high cost. We are particularly easy to lie to because we're trained to be such good consumers. A lot of what American culture has going on makes more sense if you realize that we were originally a business venture as a country. I mean, essentially, for the people who came here originally from other places, they were looking for a new life. They wanted to build their own home with their own hands and settle an area. But there's a bigger story going on besides their own little stories. And that is that there were companies that wanted to expand into new territory. And so they took it over. And that's actually a big part of our story as a country. And it's influenced the way a lot of things have developed in our country, including our religion. If you look at European religion, it was always sponsored by the state, and it still is, which makes it clunky. It can't change quickly. You've got people in the Vatican who are still keeping women from being ministers. And that's actually true of a lot of denominations around here too. A lot of them can't even marry still in the Catholic Church because they've got all these rules that are hundreds of years old. They never change. But in America, religion can follow the market. So there's going to be as many different kinds of religions or cults as there are people, because like I said, we're very easy to radicalize. And I think we are more willing to fall into that kind of thinking than we realize. And until we realize that, we're sitting ducks. One of the reasons why we are so easy to lie to is that we are ourselves good at lying to ourselves. And I'm going to explain why that is in a second about this concept of our identity coming from our story. But I would say that Russia didn't quit the Cold War. I'd say that they just went underground with it. They changed the arena, and I think they're winning because they understand better than we do, and so do a lot of other countries, how to influence people using more subtle means. It's funny because growing up, whenever we had these apocalyptic and dystopian stories, they always came with violence. You know, there's always some major revolt that would happen, or an apocalyptic event that destroyed half of life on Earth or more. But very few people, until maybe Handmaid's Tale, for example, began to ask, what would it look like if the changes happen more slowly? Instead of just a sudden apocalypse, what if you just continued to slowly move into this tightening of our lives? And I think that's really what ended up happening here, is that we've slowly just got more and more gullible over time, until now we can't even have conversations with people across the street from us because we've all been gaslit as a culture. You know, I think it's true of all of humanity, but it's true of Americans in particular for a number of different reasons. We definitely didn't learn good critical thinking skills in school. But you don't want to teach people good critical thinking skills if what you want is obedient citizens and hungry consumers. You know, there's nothing about American life that really would value education the way it needs to be valued, says the teacher. Because we view ourselves through our stories, there's a level of dishonesty that we can't escape from, self-dishonesty. Here's what I mean. Whenever you have to tell your story, even if it's just the story of what happened yesterday, you can't tell everything that happened because that would be a terrible story. You know, you're not going to sit there and recount every single event. What you're going to do is you're going to pick out the parts that mattered for the point you're trying to make. And that's what happens every time you tell a story. You're being selective. You have to eliminate some things from the story to make sense out of it. But that creates a space for a lot of dishonesty to happen for people, not just when they're talking to other people, but when they're thinking about their own story. You know, when you go back and reflect on your life, which a lot of us have been doing after we got shut in last year, we did a lot of introspecting. And the more we did that, the more we realized that we're good at lying to ourselves. And it's really hard to keep track of what is and isn't real without more connection to other people, because we need those sources of information. You know how when people look back on their life, they see things almost as if they've been choreographed to produce who you are? You know, they tend to look back on their life and say, it's almost like all the right things happen to make me who I am. Well, that's right. That's exactly how it happens. That's just causation. You know, like once you understand how things happen, as you look back on your history, you're only going to remember the parts that were relevant to who you are now. And so it's going to give the illusion of more control than's really there, and more order than's really there. Some of it's because other forces bigger than you were, you know, coming to bear on your life, but some of it was choices that you made. And then later on, you remembered some of it better than others because there were people around to remind you of those parts of your story. Maybe those people are gone, which makes it harder to remember those parts of your story. So you're constantly creating and recreating yourself, whether you realize it or not. You know, a lot of it has to do with how many people are around to remind you of who you are, but it also might not even be the same person. I'm not the same person I was when I was in my 20s. A lot has changed about the way I think and about the things that I find important. So it's natural that we would have a hard time sometimes hanging on to reality, and we have to triangulate and compare what we think to others to try to figure out what is and isn't right. And we spend a lot of time trying to eliminate our own personal bias if we're what we call free thinkers, right? We work very hard at that. But it's not going to work if we're not good at recognizing the emotional aspects of who we are, including our ability to lie to ourselves. We have the tendency to pick our reality, whether we realize it or not. And we can shape how we see our reality based on the stories that we tell ourselves and the things that we remember. That makes us both really good at creating new things, But it makes us very easy to dupe, because we know that if you believe something hard enough, you can often make it happen. That's not wrong. You can't overcome physics, except that sometimes we can, can't we? Through our thinking, we actually have found ways to rather use physics in order to do things we used to think were impossible. We're doing that all the time. But the fact is, we do make things that didn't used to exist using our creativity. And so here comes the Christian faith in particular. Out of all the faiths in the world, this is one of the ones that I know the most. You've got somebody like the Apostle Paul taking a religion that originally was about an ethnicity. It had its own identity markers that were actually physical. You had to get circumcised. There were food laws. And Paul begins to say, what about circumcision of the heart? And he starts kind of allegorizing, in a way, everything from the Old Testament and making it more abstract. And by redefining what that religion was about into just believing, now suddenly the benefits of the faith and the connection to God comes from just believing the right things and believing hard enough. I think they tapped into something that was really, really smart, just from a marketing standpoint, because faith is a part of that mechanism by which we try to make things true that weren't true before. And it legitimately works sometimes for some things. That's why the religion has thrived so much over the centuries and continues to just reboot itself. And just like coronavirus, Christianity keeps changing and coming back in a slightly different form. And I don't think it's going to go away just because the internet exists. I don't know if you remember, but a few years back, people were saying, now that the internet's here and information is so easily available, it's going to kill out religion. No, it's not. They said that back in the 1800s, once the Darwin revolution was happening, and we started figuring out how much of life's diversity was just the result of natural forces. We thought, oh, well, now nobody's going to need God anymore, because now we know where we came from. It's just, natural selection and processes. No, that's not how it works. Religion's going to continue coming back because there's something in human nature that is always reaching forward, trying to overcome, to transcend, I guess, ourselves. And I think religion is just that attempt inside of us. We're looking for something bigger than ourselves to help us grow out of where we are. And I think that's just natural for an evolutionary being to have. And if it's not a God we're looking for, then we're looking for maybe aliens to show up. Anything that's smarter than us that we hope is not going to kill us, but would instead help us get out of the rut that we're in right now as a species, because we keep digging our own holes here. You can't tell if we're making progress or if we're going backwards most of the time. So I understand this desire for something bigger than us to come down and save us, But if we don't recognize that we all have that tendency in us as well, then we won't realize that we sometimes take our own new ideas and turn them into a religion of sorts. Science can actually be treated like a religion. It doesn't have to be. It's just a tool, right? If you're doing science well, it's not something you could worship. But the thing is, some people do actually treat science as if it's a source of infallible knowledge, and they're not doing science right. That's part of what frustrated people when COVID first happened, is that whatever they said about the virus first, they changed what they said every few months. And for some people, especially people who don't really like change very much, maybe they even live in areas that have not changed all that much. Those kinds of folks, when they hear about this thing changing constantly, especially if they don't believe in evolution anyway, because that's just a bunch of phooey, you start talking about a virus coming back as a different kind just a few months later, and they don't believe you. They think you're nuts. They think you're just listening to the wrong sources of information. And the thing is, they've got smart people that get up in front of the cameras that they watch that also say the same things that they believe. So it's not that they're not looking for the information. They're the victims of misinformation. And I think that those of us who spent a lot of our time picking apart religion over the last decade, we're going to have to start focusing on something else. I mean, yes, we're going to continue trying to understand the religious natures of people, but we've got a bigger problem here. And that is the gullibility of human nature makes us susceptible to all kinds of adversaries that we don't know how to anticipate. Like I said, our dystopian futures used to always be about bombs and coming and taking over by force. But I think the best way to take over humans is just to convince them that we want what they want. It's more of the psychological operation. And so we are going to have to actually learn how to guide ourselves better. We're going to have to learn how to sort through all of the information that we get bombarded with, which is almost like trying to drink through a fire hose now. It's 24/7 through as many different sources as you want. And half of it is fake. We can actually trace these things back. But I think we're going to have to actually focus a lot on how to recognize when we're being fooled, how to look at sources of information, how to ask ourselves what our own personal bias may be, and maybe even try to also see if we are sometimes taking one particular virtue and turning it into a religion of our own. I think it happens with a lot of things. And I think it happens when we look back at people who stay within the bubble that they're in and we just say they're stupid. That's why they're there. I can't say that because, number one, I was once in bubbles like that as well. I would like to think that I would never have bought into all of the nonsense that people in white evangelical churches around here have bought into. I don't think that I would have. But that makes me then wonder, doesn't that mean that there's probably tons of people out there right now who have been faithful members of their churches, but they've got enough sense to know that something weird happened and their religion, whatever it was about before, it got taken over and turned into something like a political freak show. I would like to think that those people are out there looking for how to make sense out of what's happening. And I think it behooves us to learn how to explain to them what happened in ways that aren't condescending, because we're trying to sort through our own biases as well. And that's something we're always going to be having to struggle with. And so I want to spend a lot of time, first of all, understanding how does the way that we see our lives and how we frame our stories affect how we see ourselves, and how do I reach people who are still inside there? And for them, their commitments to their community are always going to be overriding their need to understand. And we need to understand that's what their struggle is, that it's not just a matter of not being smart. It's a matter of having commitments to relationships and to social structures that if they were to fail in those commitments, fail to put those commitments above their need to understand the world and ask harder questions, they could lose everything. They could be booted out of their communities and lose everything that they know. So we have to be very patient with people. And I'm fascinated to see where it goes next. I never would have thought that masks would end up being part of the culture wars. But where I live, it's an almost entirely racial divide. And I don't know if it's the same way in Middle Florida, but because socioeconomic power and wealth in the Deep South has always followed racial lines, mask wearing is about trying to take care of everybody else. And of course, it's particularly relevant in jobs where you're face to face with people a lot. But the wealthier you are, the more you can actually create distance between yourself and other people. Socially distancing is actually easier. So what I've observed is that the people who wear masks around here are either they're in the Black community and all the white people are not wearing them, or they're working with the Black community and so they have to because of their job. It's that much of a racial divide. And when I go into the grocery store, all the Black people in the store are wearing masks and all the white people are not wearing masks. That's kind of amazing if you think about it. I wear them because I'm a teacher and I'm around people all the time. And even though I'm vaccinated, I'm still trying to protect other people. But that's because my worldview takes upon me some of the responsibility for other people. And you would think that people raised in the Christian church would have that same sort of mentality, but they don't. Because the truth is, the religion that they have inherited is actually centered entirely around them. The irony is that they're always saying that when you leave the faith, it's because you want to be your own boss and you want to be your own God. And, they have all these ways that they frame it, but there's really nothing more egocentric than a story that says that the person who created the entire world, and it has to be a person, is very interested in you specifically. And everything that you are told about this faith is about It's in terms of what you need. You need to be saved. You need to be forgiven. You need to have another life after you die. Don't you want to come back? Don't you want to be with all the people that you've lost? These are all selling points that don't ever have to be actually proved, because most of the time it's the placebo effect. If you believe it hard enough, then a lot of this stuff will be true. Not the part about coming back from the dead, but you still can actually make yourself happier by believing you're going to be happier. So this is part of why it works. Religion continues because it works.
So I'm just wondering if you can speak to a little bit of what you've seen in your community on the public policy level. Do you see a lot of Christians in high places in county government, school government, that's keeping things kind of Christian, even though it's public school? Or do you see like a real battle between the two in your life, in your state, in your county and area?
Well, this is Mississippi. So, of course, everybody believes that their job is a mission field. And the schools that I've taught for have had a couple of different kinds of approaches to integrating faith into the workplace. And it, again, fell along racial lines. When the schools that I've taught for were predominantly white, they had this mentality that when they showed up for work, that was their mission field, and they were supposed to use their position as leaders of the school or the community to influence everything in a Christian direction. That's been around for my whole life. There's a different cultural feel to more of an African-American school where the faith is a part of their culture, but not in the same ways. It's a different kind of faith entirely. It's tailored more around what their community has needed for its memory, which involves social justice as well. It goes back to some of the movements in American history that were relevant for them, and the church was the center of social change for them. So it's definitely more a part of their culture, but it's not the kind of culture that's got the same list of purity laws. It's a different set of do's and don'ts between the two. So you have hip hop artists getting up and thanking Jesus for their success, even though everything they sang about was really not at all Christian. But that's just kind of their version of their faith. It's been modified into something that works for them. And I think there's nothing more American than that, for a religion to become more shaped according to what our needs are. And I tend to say that, and this is not totally answering your question, but it's relevant, that Augustine or whoever it was that said that we have a God-shaped hole in our heart. I can't remember who said it first. Maybe it was Descartes. I don't know. But we don't so much have a God-shaped hole that only God can fill. It's more like we have a hole-shaped God. What we do is we keep creating one kind of religion or another based on what our felt needs are at the time. And so there's as many different faiths as there are communities to produce those faiths. So yeah, the one that's here is one that says that the church is supposed to make the world a Christian place, except that, like I just said a minute ago, there's also a theology that says Jesus is going to wipe it all out and start over again. So what you've got is these two cross purposes happening, especially in the South, where we're part Baptist, but we're also part Presbyterian or Calvinist. And I know that's not necessarily separate things. Early Baptists used to be more Calvinistic, but the theology that was popular in the South after the Civil War in white churches was that theology that had no social justice in it at all, which makes sense. I mean, the Civil War essentially eliminated any parts of the church in the South in white churches that had a conscience for everyone else but themselves, And so that became what shaped white evangelical theology, this escapism, that it's not about fixing the world, it's about getting away from the world as soon as possible. And then you're just seen as a victim, passing through, being mistreated by the world somehow or another, and they go looking for the mistreatment because that would validate their faith, which actually explains a lot of things. I think a lot of Christians are kind of secretly hoping to get mistreated for their faith because then they'll feel valid, But there's this other line of thinking that's been around since the start of America, which is people like Patrick Henry really felt like that America should be governmentally Christian. And that idea didn't go away. And it stayed in circles and then came back out again during the time when the Republican Party started courting the church back in the 50s and 60s. It opened the door for all the different traditions to come in, the Christian nationalist traditions, the ones that were, even the fundamentalists got involved because They wanted America and Russia. They wanted America to win because that was going to be the end of the world, and they read their own life into the book of Revelation.
The Soviets were atheist and
They were the
America
bad guys.
believers, so therefore it was automatically God is on our side against the USSR.
Yeah. It was so black and white. It was so nice. It was nice to have a world that simple.
What is the social origins, do you think, of this kind of narrow fundamentalism? I mean, many other religions are more expansive. I'm thinking of the Catholic Church, Jewish Church, Unitarianism, all that sort of thing that seeks to strike out into the world, whereas some of this very narrow fundamentalism is very much confined, as you say, to the particular interests of the individual who's a believer and their relationship with God.
I think if I understand your question correctly, the bottom line is that, like I said, some traditions within the Christian faith, it's actually a family of faiths. It's not just one monolithic thing. There have probably been hundreds of Christian faiths. Even from the very beginning, there were competing groups, like the Jerusalem group and the Syrian groups were theologically different from each other on a bunch of issues. But I definitely think that the theological tradition that has taught so many white evangelicals, for example, that they're only here for a time to represent God somehow in the world, just long enough to be taken away, and God's going to come in and fix everything himself miraculously. That mentality has made it to where they can't get a bigger focus than themselves because there's no room for it to happen. It's been eliminated. And the best way I know to explain this, by the way, is through an analogy. And I can probably show you this picture if it will let me do it. What I love about this picture is you can just get it from stock images, but it's a group of people seen from a bird's eye view, and they're creating a shape out of the negative space that they are standing around. It's a pretty good illustration of what a social structure is, but it's physicalizing it, of course. But the concept of a social structure is that we construct things and ideas and systems that are made up entirely out of the people that keep it going. The shape comes from the shape that the people create. And this kind of explains, by the way, why people get mad when you leave their religion or identify yourself as somebody not as a part of their religion. You've just affected their number. Since what they are passing along is literally a construct made of people, you just removed one person from the construct. And so it's an attack on their faith, whether you mean for it to be or not. But what's fascinating about this is they're not creating a cross by stepping into the shape of a cross. They're creating a cross by simply not stepping into that place and using the negative space. And I think that's what's happened with theology and working racism baking it into the theology of white churches, is that if you go back to the history of those churches, they went through time periods, not only during the Civil War, but then again during the Civil Rights Movement. They had to learn how to eliminate any social conscience from their message so that they could avoid all the controversy and keep their theology as limited as possible to themselves and getting to heaven. And because that was the main function the religion was serving for them as sort of a hope of escape, that's as big as their vision needs to be, and they're content with it. And in fact, they think that if you try to make a bigger vision of it and try to fit the world and caring for the world, or dealing with racism, for example, as a social problem, they see that as outside of their wheelhouse. But there's nowhere in their theology that says you should not care about these things. You should not work for racial reconciliation. It doesn't have to be said, though. It can be said by not saying it, if that makes sense. Through the things that the church and their theology avoid talking about, they make clear that doesn't have any place in their culture.
The Christian church has always characterized their hate as loving a sinner, hating the sin. Mm-hmm. And that argument can be used for anything. Sure. The same, they use it for any and every person they nurture and hate for. So I'm going to have to reject that argument. They are not charitable in their thinking at all. It's not about love. It is legitimate hate that they learned in church.
Thank you, Jim.
Okay.
No, go ahead, Neil, if you want to comment on that.
Well, it's difficult to deconstruct it because, again, it's one of those things where I feel like it's representing a very vast system of thought and way of looking at a group of people. And I'm telling you that I'm watching people cry themselves to sleep, mothers and fathers crying themselves to sleep, wringing their hands, worried about their children because they genuinely believe, because they were taught this, they genuinely believe that same-sex attraction is going to destroy their child. They genuinely believe that. And everything that they're doing is motivated out of a love of their child. They just are very misguided. And what they're doing is actually causing harm. And I think that you could still reframe the question as, is what you're doing making your child better? And if they start asking questions like that, it kind of goes back to what you were saying about not being able to answer why things are right or wrong. Obviously, one of the greatest weaknesses of the Christian faith, which there is no such thing as one monolithic Christian faith. So whenever you make a generalized statement that the church always does X, it's a family of religions that's been around for hundreds of years and keeps changing. So there is no monolithic Christian faith. But there's definitely a lot of this teaching you what you're supposed to care about, and they're doing the best they know how to do. They're misinformed, but they're trying. And I see that they're trying. And so that's why hate doesn't feel like the right word. But I think that because the Christian faith is rooted in the divine command theory in some form or another, that morality goes back to there is a God, and whatever God says is right is what's right. That doesn't actually lend itself to analysis and breaking apart why something is good or not good. It's just God says it's not good, so you don't need to know why. You just do what God says. Certainly asking them to try to explain why something is actually harmful might be a useful exercise to give them. And I think that's at least something to start with. But I think what you'll find is that they're really doing what they think is right, and they're just badly misguided. And if you can teach them to start looking for, does it cause harm or does it benefit the other person, they could be more critical in their thinking about their own ways of relating to people. But their communities will militate against that. They're backed up by millions of people who feel the same way they do, and that is a strong reinforcer for people.
Okay. I just was going to ask you, since you were talking about the emotional aspect, it's kind of on another little trail here, but are you familiar with sociologist, I might not say his name right, Emil Durkheim? He talked about collective efflorescence, and it's that whole good feeling from being in a community. Just as in talking about, for those of us that are ex-Christians or whatever, ex-religious people, you can get it in a performing arts center from the music, or you can get it at a football
concert.
But that, I had stumbled on him and I just thought that was an interesting aspect. And since we brought up the emotional aspect, that might be something. I put it in the notes in the chat. And if somebody wants to look him up and kind of get that, that's one of the things that keeps Christians thinking that they're feeling the presence of God.
Yeah, religion exists and thrives because it is meeting needs. Yeah. People on the outside may not realize how it's meeting their needs, but it is meeting needs. And one of those needs is that sense of solidarity and a group of people all singing the same notes in harmony with each other. I got to say, that's a powerful thing. I've watched atheists try to recreate it in their own groups, and it doesn't. It's just
doesn't work.
It's not. And if somebody tries to start, imagine one more time, I'm going to tear the walls apart. We really have not inspired a lot of great art just yet, and because there's there's no such thing as an ideology that's just atheism or free thought. That's just the beginning of a journey is all that is. That's just the answer to one question about what you believe. We have a lot more things we got to figure out, like what he said about having more of an ethical center. We have a lot of things that we have to replace religion with after we get rid of it. Because if we woke up tomorrow and there were no religions on the planet, something like it would appear again. Yes. It would be a different story, but it would be aimed at some of the same needs that the other religions were aimed at. Until we understand that, we're never really going to be moving forward. And honestly, I don't know what to expect. Like I don't have any belief system that ensures that I think humanity is going to survive. There's nothing that guarantees we're going to make it. Maybe something better than us will come along. It might hurt us. It might not. I hope they're nice to us, whatever it is. We'll probably make it, whatever it is. We'll probably make a version of ourselves that's so much better than ourselves. So many of our movies are now about AI, and they're about, other kinds of transhumanism kinds of stories.
Yes. But if we don't work on our emotional health, we're not going to do much better than the religious groups, because we get so caught up with rational thought and not that you can't be emotional or rational about your emotions, because like you said, you do a lot of self-examination and going through those things. It's important.
Well, and it's an observation that I've made, because I've gotten to rub shoulders with a lot of luminaries by accident. I almost feel like for about 15 minutes, I was the Forrest Gump of the atheist movement. I just kept showing up places. And because I ended up talking to some, important people and hearing their take on things, I realized that, number one, they were always talking as an outsider. So they never quite understood the thing they were talking about, because they had never been on the inside. But the other is that there is this belief there that keeps coming out that if we could just be purely rational, just more fully, completely rational, intellectual, then things will be better. But that's not who we are. I mean, look at ourselves. Go look in the mirror. We're also animals.
Right.
And animals need to be hugged, right? Animals need food. They need to be a part of a community. And these are things that if we try to forget these things, we're only going to be harming ourselves. We're just going to get more and more addicted to antidepressants and anti-anxiety meds, because nothing we're doing is really the way that an animal should be living. So yeah, there's whole sides of us we have to take ownership of. And just saying there's no gods and religious people are idiots is not really going to actually get us anywhere.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. Well, thank you. I know, Dan. Much.
Actually, I talked to him some.
Oh,
yeah.
Yes.
No, that's okay.
Okay. Didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no, okay.
Really appreciate your visit and bringing up all these topics. It's been quite stimulating, and I look forward to reading your blog. Everybody go to Pathos and look for Godless and Dixie. And hopefully we can have you back again sometime to explore this area much more in depth.
I'd love to. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all very much for coming. And if you have any comments or questions you want to make, just shoot them to me and I'll send them on to Mr. Carter. Thank you all very much. We'll see you next time.
Bye. See y'all.